Welcome back to Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I'm your host, Dr. Tabish Zaman. By now, I'm sure it's very clear to you that we are living in an era that is defined by what I call paradox. And why I say that? Because we can go to the moon, but still struggle to design a fair housing. We can 3D print organs, but can't feed the hungry. Again, we have perfected the algorithms, but not our ability to listen. We have predicted hurricanes after hurricanes, but not our own moral storms. And while the world is burning, the language of progress for me still sounds and smells like profit. And I'll give you some numbers. Last year alone, the planet, it broke every known climate record. 2024 was the hottest year since records began, with global temperatures 1.56 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Another one, 10 richest nations. They emitted more than 2/3 of global carbon dioxide, while the poorest half of the humanity, they contributed less than 10%. Still, they are the one facing the greatest losses. Across Europe, you can see an estimated 1 in 3 species now risk extinction. And the UN reports the climate displacement will uproot over 200 million people by 2050. I'm being very conservative with my numbers. And still, the conversation around innovation, it continues as if they exist in vacuum, completely detached from social and ecological realities they shape. But then, you know what? There are builders who refuse that detachment. People who believe design isn't about objects, it's about systems. That creativity, when stripped of conscience for them, is just engineering. And my guest today is one of those people, Kasper Benjamin Reimer, the founder of No Objectives, a non-profit research and design institution which reimagines how we turn minority into majority action. An architect by training, Kasper stands at the crossroad of strategy, activism, and more importantly, empathy, which transforms complex environmental and social challenges into collective, tangible change. He also writes for Illuminum, a sustainability intelligence platform, and is the voice behind what he calls branded activism, using design and storytelling not to sell products, but to mobilize purpose. And in a world where I strongly believe sustainability has become a slogan and activism basically a marketing tool, Kasper's work brings us back to their roots, redesigning system not just to perform, but to care. Because I feel the true test of the design isn't how beautiful it looks, but how justly it serves. So, Kasper, absolutely honored and welcome to Builders of the Broken Bazaar.
Thank you so much for having me. And I might have to steal that intro for myself next time. You put it so eloquently. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's all you're doing, Kasper. So thank you so much. It's an honor for us also to have you here. So let's begin. Let's begin with the very first thing. And I want to start with the big system itself, the one we all live and design within. So again, some of the numbers around how the material consumption last year, it has crossed around 100 billion tons for the first time, which essentially means like sort of only 7.2% was recycled back into use, which means 92% of what we make ends up as waste. And now you've spoken about climate collapse and social collapse. They're the two sides of the same design problem. And, what we basically call unsustainable. So when you look at the system around us, energy, food, housing, finance, where do you see that design failing the most, Kasper?
It's a very good question. I think one of the key things is that all of these interdependent crises that are also the polycrisis, as we call them, sort of the compounding risks of multiple crises being bigger than the individual ones, all more or less stem from one sort of place, which is the crisis of meaning. and maybe it's good to sort of, at least my interpretation of it and understanding is that, all of these crises that we're seeing are a symptom of a disconnect that we have as human beings. So essentially, at least through my work and through the research I've done, one of the great findings and the great revelations of mine before I began sort of this journey was that we keep sort of trying to treat the systems. So we are in overshoot, we are in sort of a collapsing state, and we keep sort of taking the bucket and throwing like water out of a sinking ship. And I think it really led me to try to figure out where is it, like, how did we go so wrong? Sort of what are the ways we got here? So I sort of read a lot of amazing literature from thinkers that I really enjoy like Daniel Schwarzenberger and E.O. Wilson and all of these incredible systems, and of course Vanilla Meadows and all of these. And one thing that really struck me as a very interesting paradox is that, where you find the most community and the most sense of empathy is generally in the places where we have the least. Because in those places, people are depending on each other. And sort of that connection between each other is basically a part of their survival. So I was really puzzled to figure out that that's, I think, for me, that was a great paradox of our time, is that, why is it that the places that have the least are also the places that are showing the most amount of empathy towards one another? And I came to the realization at some point that what has actually happened is that when we begin to store surplus, so surplus starts with the invention of agriculture, because this is where we can store sunlight and food that we can then keep. And this is the first time sort of humanity starts to disconnect from the actual world, because it means that all of a sudden we can take surplus energy and store it, and that makes us much more mobile. It makes us enable a new way of relating to the land. And of course, it's not just surplus, it's not just bananas, because they will rot very quickly. So it's what I call lootable, or actually what Luke Kemp calls lootable surplus. So it's surplus that can store for quite some time, so you can utilize it for later. And one of the things that then happens is that we naturally, because of this disconnect, we naturally begin to be able to create hierarchies and enforce dominance. And it's also why we're now living in a world where the more wealthy you are, the less connection you have with other people. So if you're very wealthy, you live in a giant mansion without really any people, or you fly private jets. And I think that's kind of a incredibly interesting symptom of a sick culture, because it's completely misunderstood that my happiness is dependent on everyone else's happiness, because we are one connected system. But because of the surplus, we were able to disconnect first from the ecological sort of foundation, and now since the social one. And then we've mistaken sort of progress for meaning. And in reality, we haven't really created any progress. We've just created a more and more sick system that optimized for that one thing. And I think that's where my sort of journey began, when realizing that, we need a different way of connecting again. So that's why I left architecture and started to think of ways that I could try to create that connection again.
I think you've put that point very simply in terms of the optimization. So is it fair to say that we have looked at the system, and obviously there's a disconnect amongst that, but then are we to blame when we talk about optimizing system and we've lost empathy somewhere in that disconnection, and it's all about efficiency, which is a beautiful word if you look at the corporate world, efficiency. But are we optimizing for that, and we are not at all looking at empathy? And again, you have said, haven't you, in terms of the crisis of this whole design, it is not technical, it's moral. And
Yes.
we can't really build anything except sort of accountability. So what does that mean when we have identified this problem or this system or this disconnection, But then when we are designing for the future, what does it actually mean for individuals without that accountability, without that empathy?
Without empathy and accountability, it means that you are susceptible to being hijacked. And what we've seen is that, we might think that neoliberalism and capitalism have been sort of a natural progression of our system, but it's actually not. It's a hijack of our system that is meant to put all the wealth upwards and leave the rest of us sort of stranded. And I shouldn't say the rest of us, because I grew up in the global minority and has immense amount of privilege. But it is that system, that system has been optimized to create efficiency for one thing, and that's for capital. And that capital flows one way, and that's upwards, because that's how the system is optimized for. And I think, there's nothing more stupid than to optimize or make something efficient that you shouldn't have had in the first place. But our system cannot ask that question, because it just has one parameter, and that's the profit accumulation. And I think that's where we've gone wrong. So I think with the disconnect we envisioned and we got there, I don't think it's a natural progression that we ended up here. It's that we were not sort of smart enough or wise enough to ensure that those systems were not hijacked by someone who wanted to basically take advantage of them. And I will say that there is actually a lot of cultures that have resisted this. So a lot of indigenous cultures did not, become part of this and understood that they had the wisdom to stand against it. But the general hegemony of the world today is that we have optimized for that one singular system, and that's what's killing us slowly.
And we've all organized around the same notion, but then comes your no objective. I love the name, to be honest. It feels very rebellion, especially in these times when everything is all about metrics and KPIs. So your organization, it began as a non-profit experiment, and again, you call it slow activism, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And of course, now I see it doing so well. It's become a sort of a voice, because it's so innovative in terms of system thinking and environmental design. So please tell us and tell my audience how it all began, and was it a moment when you realized that the whole design needs to stop performing, but it's more about the transformation, which I see coming out from no objectives very, very clearly.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, because as we embark on the journey of sort of systems understanding, and I'm a trained architect, so it wasn't really in the cards that this was something I were supposed to do, because generally you become an architect and you're trained to want to build operas and become sort of famous for your monuments. But somehow there's something beautiful in architecture that sort of sat quite right with the systems understanding. So I started my career as a trained architect, and then I slowly graduated into running a research and design center in a completely traditional architecture office. And of course, you're always evolving. And 10 years ago, I was sort of optimizing for what the same thing everyone else was, sort of trying to figure out how could we build the buildings with the least amount of environmental impact, but still scale it. And of course, not understanding that I was, of course, going to accelerate the problem because it wasn't really grappling with the root cause. But throughout that process, I sort of slowly learned that, that's not how systems change, and we need to intervene in sort of in the places that makes most sense to really guide the system again. And then it became more and more an act of sort of activism in my former role, and it created some tensions between the place I worked before and what I wanted to do, because I think I had thought that I could take an existing corporate office and I could transform it, and then it would be sort of the way I wanted it to be. But I quickly realized sort of 2 years ago that that's not how it works. You can't, if you set a company up for growth and all of its systems are based on it, I can't actually move that tanker. No matter how many people I organized or how many things we did, there were still shareholders or people that were sort of banking on selling the company later and all of that stuff. And it was just simply too big an assignment for me. And I sort of came to the realization that we can't keep tweaking the same system. We need to start building it ourselves. So I quit my job and said, I will do this, and I have to start this from the sort of in the right terms. So I created the non-for-profit. I'm in complete transparency with all financial things that I have, and running on these principles of how I see a post-growth business actually running. And I also have this thing that I'm not gonna grow as a consultancy or a company myself, but what I, however, will do is I will create like a lot of mobilization around partnerships with other companies that are doing the same to create sort of the small scale advantage of being myself and also the large scale advantage of mobilizing multiple voices. So, and that's really what I think the future is. Actually, I think the future is this understanding that together we can do so much more, but we need to base it on the right approach from the beginning. And so basically that's what I'm doing now. So no objective is basically that test bed to see how we can enable that post-growth world that we so desperately need.
I think there's a lot of entrepreneurial insights and learning there in terms of the inside calling. But then you say your mission is to make complex ideas accessible and actionable. And you're really talking about redistributing that agency, about redesigning who gets to design. Because when I look in the UK, for example, again, the innovation funding scheme, when you look at some of the numbers around it, 78% of those recipients are white majority, and only 1% of that is sort of a black. And again, I'm taking you in a direction which, again, minority and majority. So when you say research from the margin, it leads to change at the center. Where are those small insights coming from, and how do we actually make it work for the broader system? So like you said that, okay, in your case, obviously you sort of stripped yourself out of the whole system and you designed your own system. But again, for people who are still in that, stuck in there, fighting against the institution with all those roadblocks, how do they go about bringing that into the sort of a center from the more minority?
I think that's a really good question, because I think that was maybe one of the reasons why I when you work in this field, it can be easy to sink into despair because things can seem very difficult, because it's like harsh facts and you don't see a lot of progress. But what we did in Denmark with a project or a mobilization effort called Reduction Roadmap that I ran with some great colleagues was exactly this. We were stuck in this feeling that we could not move the needle. There was nothing we could do. No matter what we did, it was sort of like punching a duvet, like nothing really happened. But we sat down, or I posted on social media that now we had to be the time for us to figure out what it meant for the building industry in Denmark to actually live up to the climate science. How do we do that? So, and of course, then I posted this and no one really sort of listened. But after a while, two companies sort of said, we want to help you figure this out. So we started this, it was a firm called Zebra, architecture firm, and an engineering firm called Artela. And so together with the top universities, we were lucky enough to get some funding to try to see, could we do this sort of pathway? How would it mean for the industry to do this? And we got some of the funding, and we did the entire sort of research. And it very quickly sort of became apparent that it was much worse than we thought. So basically, the numbers told us that we had to reduce emissions from the building industry in Denmark by 96% within 3 to 7 years. So that was very different than the sort of net zero 2050 plans, the industry was sort of saying was the target. But that was basically because we were basing it off sort of percentage reduction and not climate science. And then was sort of the despair moment, sort of what do we do? And coming from an architecture background, One thing architects are very good at is actually explaining complexity, because when you do a hospital or you do a sort of a bigger office, it can actually be quite technical because it is a lot of different systems that are going into each other. So one thing we knew, at least from the work we've done before, is that if you have to get people to choose or like accept the direction you're trying to go, you need to make it very understandable. So what we did is that we took this research out of the dusty old PDFs, and then we basically explained it through infographics and very clear storytelling about what this meant for the industry. And I'll come to why I think this actually is the key part of change, because in the beginning we just realized we just released it to the industry saying this is how bad it is. We need to do something, and we were sort of convinced that when you tell them there's these facts, then people will change, because they will also think it's impossible, and we need to save our children's future. But in reality, nothing really happened, and I think this is where a lot of movements go very wrong, and including what we did, is that we think that we should just put the facts out there, and even if you explain it very well, people will then automatically join you. But they won't. And the reason why they won't is that if people had said, like, we're going to follow this roadmap, they will fall into something called the multipolar trap. It means that they would be outcompeted by all the companies that weren't going to follow that roadmap. So we said, okay, instead, why don't we try to mobilize the entire industry around a shared ask? So we all come together, and then we ask politicians to change legislation so that we are going to be adherents to the climate science. In this way, it's not that anyone in particularly need to follow the roadmap, is that we are just going to ask for a level playing field, so everyone has to do it.
Yeah.
And we ran that campaign because we knew that the politicians were going to actually negotiate on the emission caps of the industry.
Yeah.
And to our surprise, we managed to mobilize an entire industry. With now it's 920 companies, the vast majority of workspaces in the Danish building industry supporting this. And we were then able to deliver that message for the industry and say that, or the politician to say that we want this. And I think for me, this is where it all clicked, is that if you want to change the system, don't ask individual actors to do it, because they will lose against all the other ones that don't care. But if you mobilize everyone to ask for systemic change that evens the playing field, people are much more willing to do this, because there's not the fear of losing out. And I think that was really the lesson for how these systems can change. And that's also why you don't need to be an independent actor like me. You can also do that from within, because I was hired inside the system. But it's a way to understand that you can actually create change. You don't have to just leave the system. I chose to leave the system because I wanted to live by different, visions in the work I did. But, you can still create change.
I think that's a great story. I'm really intrigued in terms of the timeline, because mobilizing, a range of stakeholders coming on board. And again, I know you mentioned about the shared insight or the shared collaboration, shared requirement that way. But still, I think, do you think it's, again, first of all, I would like to ask in terms of what sort of timeline we are looking at when it comes to that success? And the second, does it come down to the community? And when I say community, we are looking at population. So that way, I believe Copenhagen, the country itself, the city itself, can it be translated to other parts of the world? Or do you find that it'll be a difficult task with different mobilization, different strategy, and different understanding and insight?
For the timeline is that it took 3 months to mobilize the entire industry. So it can be done very quickly. So that was not the issue. I think you are right in the sense that it's about community, and you need to have trust in institutions to that. I think like Denmark is, of course, an easier case for this. But we actually do know that reduction roadmap was then transferred to Australia and Sweden, and now hopefully soon Norway. And what is super interesting there is that we were very aware that we can't run a campaign in Sweden or in Australia, because it's not the context. So it has to be rounded. So we did what sort of permaculture movement did, is that we're going to explain you all of the principles, what we did, how we did it, but you have to do it in your context. And of course, then these movements start at different scales. Maybe Denmark was a little bit more ready for this. But one of the things that I found so interesting in all of this is that when I wrote that first text on social media, I wanted to actually ask if we could, stop speculative new build. Because if we have to adhere to the climate science, basically we know that in Denmark we have to reduce all speculative new builds by 80%. But I also knew that it was completely impossible to mobilize the industry around that. Yeah. But, the overturn window can be moved, and we've seen it time and time again. So basically, it was always our vision to create a building stop movement, but it was not feasible at that point. So reduction roadmap became the best adjacent way there. And now today, in Denmark, there's a huge building stop movement, and it's endorsed by 2 political parties in the upcoming elections. And that's the same thing for other contexts, is that they might not be ready for doing exactly reduction roadmap, but just bringing the actual science to the industry moves the middle. And that's how, you tip the system gradually. You have to constantly sort of move it in the overturn window into what was before impossible, but now possible. And that's at least what we've been trying to do with these initiatives.
No, massive congratulations on that. I think we need to hear more of that, and especially the method and the methodology, which I'm interested in terms of how you go about doing this, because this is a huge success. Now, I'm sorry, I'm pushing you in another direction here,
okay. No
building on that, because I think you're very big on that. And which is why I wanted to have the discussion with you. You always speak about margins, and you speak about that's where we look towards the future. That's where you could rehearse. That's where you could try. And I find that very, very powerful, because we live in the Western world here in the UK, Denmark, But if you look at the global South, the indigenous community, refugees, and the informal workers, they are adapting to the conditions the rest of the world is only beginning to face. And again, if you look at UNHCR data, again, I'm being very conservative with my numbers. By 2015, we are talking about 216 million people that could be displaced by climate-related disaster. So this is not a future problem. It's happening as we see, So how do we translate those lived local adaptation into the design principles which you have and successfully done that? Again, without falling into the trap of which I strongly call extraction or tokenism, as we call it.
Yeah. I think that's a very good question. And I think it is a cultural shift that needs to happen. So I think there's 2 things to this. I think there's a break from the cultural hegemony that needs to happen. So we need to break the imperialist sort of appropriation that has been happened for the last many hundred years. And then at the same time, we need to distribute power. So basically realizing that, in that cultural awakening, we have to realize that you need to give power to people that are not you, and you need to make them actually understand that they have their own agency. And I think one of the ways we do this is that if we dismantle the understanding of how the cultural hegemony is now by saying that we've been told a lie about the capitalist system, there's a different way. And if we get people to understand that, I am because you are, that empathy can switch. And I think one of the best way to understand that is that I think there's a lesson from Nepal that I really love, and that's when the forests were declining, and the state had for many years tried to sort of figure out what to do and conserve it, and they were keep running into problems and were not really effective at doing this because people were logging illegally and sort of exploiting it. And then at some point they said, okay, we're going to give the forest back to all the local communities, it's going to be your responsibility to look out for the forest and to actually take care of it, which is a huge sort of, you would almost never see that today, because that's a huge transfer of power to someone else. And within 30 years, what no one had expected happened was that all of a sudden the forest cover went back sort of 30%, more than anything could have ever imagined. And that was because when you give people their own agency and they can see they are dependent on, in this case it was the forest, they will do everything in their power to make it flourish, because basically their needs are based on it. And I think that's the beautiful thing about understanding the redistribution of power, is that it's not an act of giving control, it's an act of care.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you start to care for others, it cares for you as well. And I think that's really the cultural sort of break we need to understand. And I think for me, Nepal is sort of the best case for understanding that we need to relinquish control. And I think that is something that happens through culture. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. And again, talking within the realms of, innovation or entrepreneurship, agency is very important, very, very important. And again, if you look at in a commercial sense, and the example you gave is very, very powerful that way, because there's something happening at the ground level. There's something happening at the most sort of, the lower echelon, as we call it. But
Yeah.
in a commercial sense, given how our economy is organized and everything around us, you can see when we look at the lower level, and I don't mean it in a derogatory way, but
No.
talking about users who are situated there. But the idea of user is very sacred, within the commercial terms. And when we look at the current system, which actually needs the change from health to housing, do you agree with me that it was never designed with users in mind? And it has kept on adding to where we are now. So how do we persuade the institutions, and especially those who've got the rights, like the political parties, the government agencies, all around us? How do we tell them that the minority insight, or people who are at the bottom, their information isn't just data, it's actually very innovative data, a place where we can experiment, a place where we can, really come up with powerful solutions?
Yeah. I
I
think
don't know if that
that's
question makes sense.
it makes sense. I think it makes so much sense, because I think there is this. It's again a little bit of a theory of change question, because I might think that I would be quite doubtful to say that we can get the current system of politics to change.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can mobilize people to change the system to get the politics to work. And I think that's a very either you try to mobilize to create the conditions for the existing system to change, or you mobilize to put a new system in place. And I think a very good example of this is what has happened in the US. I think is a really good indicator of why just trying to change an existing system doesn't work. So when Barack Obama was elected, everyone was incredibly excited, because it was like, now change are going to happen. But in reality, he was still a president living in a neoliberal economy, and there was no way he could actually change the things that were needed to be changed. So when he didn't deliver on his promises, what happened was that it sowed the ground for Donald Trump, because all of a sudden you have people that are struggling to get by, and they see the same actor, even though it's the actor that says they're going to work for you, fail over and over again. So at some point you become desperate, and then you vote for something that's just changed, that just isn't the system anymore. And I think this is also where we are finding ourselves right now, in a place where it's both incredibly, scary, but also hopeful. Because before, the market sort of dictated politics. It was that now it would be completely impossible for almost any state leader to question, the neoliberal doctrine. But now, basically politics has entered the stage again with Donald Trump. I'm not at all endorsing Donald Trump. I think it's insane what he does, and it's an authoritarian regime. But what has happened is that he actually now imposes tariffs and really unorthodox economic systems that no one in their right mind would have imposed 20 years ago. And that's all because politics is now in the driving seat.
Yeah.
I think that also makes a really compelling case for getting an actual sort of left leader in charge that are talking about redistributing, ending, canceling debt, and all of these things that are unorthodox and would not have happened in the system, in the system we had before. So I think, slowly the system is eroding, so something new can emerge. And I think it's our job as facilitators and communicators and system sort of weavers is to create the conditions that make that force strong enough to take over. Because now I've seen the first crack in the cultural economic hegemony, and I think that's the way we have to sort of leverage now.
I cannot agree more in terms of how it has set up a breeding ground in a way. And again, we are at the crossroad at the moment, and it's up to us, the current generation, the current thinkers and the communicators, as to where we push this narrative. Absolutely. Now, we speak about the politics and the government and all these individuals, and it cannot go without the ethics in terms of, so again, this is something you talk a lot about, isn't it, in terms of how you speak about the branded activism, and again, looking at the extraordinary disconnect between the stories you and me are trying to tell and the systemic change. So, bridging that gap, how do you make design and the communication accountable, very, very accountable? And I think you're one of the finest individuals to talk about that, because you've got that success behind you. Accountable to the causes which you and me are claiming to serve. How do we bridge that gap between designing something and communicating something? Because that's where the skill lies, I believe.
Yeah, it is. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the fine line we have to do. I think there is this general trend when we talk about branding or communication that it's sort of a tool used to manipulate. But I mean, in reality, all communication is manipulation, basically. So either you can use it as a source to perpetuate the existing system, or you can use it as a source to expand empathy and change the system to redistribute power to the people. And I think that's where our sort of understanding of how to do this has to be, is that, am I designing something for the benefit of the few, or am I designing and communicating something that benefits the many? Am I seeking to centralize power or to redistribute it? And I think that is really something we always have to think about when we do this, because you can also use these tools to create eco-fascism if you don't do them well. So it's always about having this understanding of empathy and care, and that you use it in a way to deliver power to the people that need to have it and not to centralize it. So that's very much what I continuously do in the work that I do, is that I cannot work on anything that will centralize power. I work only on projects that help redistribute it to the places where it needs to go. And of course, that is sometimes difficult because, as I said before, with the mobilization effort we had, is that when I said that let's mobilize, or when we together said that let's mobilize the industry around our emission cap, there was a lot of people saying, yeah, but it's not enough. It's not systems change. You're just tinkering around the edges. And that's absolutely true if you don't have a plan for where to go. The plan was always to stop building, and in that way to redistribute power back to the people and not have developers drive the speculation housing market. But you cannot get there overnight. So it's always about understanding where do you go to. It's like, so you need the direction. So normative transformation is great when they set out a clear direction, as very opposed to incrementalism, which is just steps without any formal direction. And I think that's the key. So it is tricky to understand this, but as long as you have the bigger plan mapped out, you can actually use these sort of tools that we know work because they've worked for the last 70
Yeah.
years to actually reorient our systems.
Have you had real cheerleaders who have been with you and say, what you have come up with, what your plans, what your visions are, and how you see the system, we are on board, and that must have given you a bit of a push when you have been developing all of this.
Yeah, I think like it's I very quickly realized that you cannot go this distance alone. This is something
Yeah.
you need to have moral support because it's a tough battle.
Yeah.
It really is when we do this. So I very quickly said, I set up partnerships with people I work with that
Yeah.
I know share the same idea, and in that way we are very agile. It's not I have to find new partnerships all the time. Is that I stick very close to the group that
Mhm.
I'm in, and of course I get like new ones that join. But I am really sort of happy to have a safe space where people that I really enjoy working with and I know we can change the world together. Because to be honest, when I started this journey and started speaking out, it is incredibly harsh because you are met with threats,
Yeah.
lawsuits, all of these things for actually just saying what the climate science says. So if you don't have that group, so that's one of the first things I would recommend anyone that goes into this line of work is that find the people that you can do this with because you can't do it alone.
Yeah. No, you're a
Because-
living case study, Casper, I would say, given your background and given your achievements in terms of what you've managed to achieve on the ground, because collaboration is not easy at all. And then where is that point where collaboration is also seen as a sort of a toxic endeavor, and then
yeah,
you decide to walk away from the whole thing having done all this work? So there's always that danger, but again, it's a long journey, and I'm hoping this carries on because your brand is very, very effective. Now I will pivot you back to the
yeah,
question, the discussion. I love that, story, personal story, but, in your own words, you have said that every brand which you build and which you have managed to build is basically a public actor. Whether we admit it or not, we are in the face there. Um, so it does feel like you're redefining at least the notion of capitalism, um, and which is a challenge in itself. So, how do you ensure that activism? Again, I'm sorry, I'm taking you back to the marketing thing, but
it's
how do
okay.
you ensure that activism isn't is just a branding exercise? And what's the lesson we can learn to keep it authentic and accountable? Which we've seen again in Palestinian causes, which is happening. There's a real mobilization. So how do we make it sure that it is really authentic and accountable to the people and the purpose?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I myself have sort of four things that I work with, and at least that are the how I categorize what I can work on to get there. They don't have to exactly be there, but they have to be a stepping stone there. So
Hmm.
the first is sort of whatever action I help facilitate, either a movement or a project, has to deliver or have the promise of getting to delivering on those things. Well, the first is that it has to reduce the pressure on the planetary and social boundaries. So that it has to be one of the things because we are in overshoot. Everything we do from now on, there's no mitigation or adaptation without mitigation, and so forth. Every action we take has to be something that gets us back into the safe and just boundaries, while enhancing well-being. There's no way around that. But that doesn't mean that you cannot do something that can be invasive right now, but at the end becomes um, actually does it further down the line in the value chain. So a good example, I think, is that when a beaver enters a new site, it
Hmm.
basically destroys the site all around it at once. But basically, their restructuring leads to an increase of biodiversity of 37-fold. So their small sort of interaction might seem destructive, but in the bigger scheme of things, it actually leads to more well-being. So I think a very good example of this in the real world is that if we were to stop building tomorrow new buildings, that would be a huge benefit for the climate, but we still have an existing building stock that needs to be taken care of.
True.
So in order to get that existing building stock to actually be ready for more people to live there, but also to reduce its energy demands and material demands, we need to renovate them. And that comes at a cost. But our job is then to find out how to renovate these houses in a way that the total footprint on all the boundaries are lower than the emission it would cost if we didn't do it. And I think that's an example of this. And then that's the first one. And the second one is that it needs to take into account both local and global contexts. You cannot do anything that is basically good for my country or in this context, and that perpetuates harm somewhere else. It simply doesn't work. And then the third thing is, and the last thing is that it has to happen at a decent pace and scale. So we cannot build something that we think like in 100 years it's going to be great. It's about right now. It's about doing it at this. And those sort of three principles is how I try to guide all of the branding exercises that I have, because that's essentially how I myself can figure out, is this something that I can do? And because it is sometimes tricky. Nothing is black and white. Things can be actually quite difficult to figure out. So this is at least that's my approach to this.
Yeah. So have you had like, again, in your illustrious work you've done up until this point, have you ever had to walk away from a project which you felt was designed, again, timeline wise, impact wise, it was just for image, not for actual deliverables which you stand for?
Yeah, that I did many times.
Yeah, you have.
Like,
Okay. All right.
yeah, when I mean, it is just like when I get requests for me to work with people, I can only deliver on anything if it lives up to what I just said. And to be honest, 9 out of 10 doesn't. They simply don't. I always ask, the first question I ask when everyone comes in the door is, the thing you're proposing something that is needed in a world without any growth? And if they can't answer yes, then I can't take the assignment, because I don't want to optimize anything that doesn't need to be there. It makes no sense.
And those stand on very strong principles, Casper, I believe.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So we now move into the next section in terms of talking about innovation, because that gets spoken quite a lot. And in your line of work, in my line of work, when we talk about innovation, we hear a lot about disruption, which is very, very popular. But what I believe is, what we don't talk enough is the duty, which again you have been talking about. There are some numbers which World Bank tells us, and again, given your expertise in climate related activities and your effort in mitigating that, we're talking about what, in terms of number, 178 trillion from global GDP by 2070 when it comes to the climate related losses. But innovation, the term innovation, is still measured by valuation, not restoration, which you're talking about. Yeah. Again, you have argued that innovation should be an act of care, as sort of a maintaining that balance rather than sort of looking after or chasing that novelty. So what does it mean to design when you're thinking about scale, if that makes sense? And how do we build that into the DNA of the new organization that, again, are sort of so mechanized for sort of scale, speed, there's no reflection whatsoever?
No, yeah, I understand. I think the first thing is to, that's why I started a nonprofit, is that if your business isn't optimized for profit, you automatically, at the first encounter, don't need to optimize for that. That's not what your business is about, basically. So it removes the first really harsh barrier. And then, again, when you optimize for design and innovation, I come back to the principles I just shared. If it adapts without mitigation, it's a problem.
Yeah.
And if that's the thing. We need to understand that all innovations has to deliver on those things. It has to take accountable for the entire value chain. Both local and global. It needs to reduce pressure on the planetary boundaries and increase social cohesion,
Mm-hmm.
and needs to do it at a pace and scale. And I think this is what we get wrong, because when we innovate today, we optimize for one fixed metric. It's either profit, or even if it's not, it's generally then we optimize for CO2, and then we
Yeah.
forget all the 8 other boundaries. And
Yeah.
it's in that tunnel vision we end up doing something incredibly wrong. And we wrote a report which is it's called the Beyond the Roadmap. It was after our reduction roadmap campaign. So we wanted to make it clear that it was great that we have mobilized an industry, but we also want to tell people or show people the transition to a post-growth industry, because it's
Yeah.
easy to tell them that this is great what you did, but it's not enough. So what we did is that we had worked with Stockholm Resiliency Center before on how to quantify planetary boundaries for the building industry. And in that learning, there was a really interesting finding where they said, uh, it is true there is 9 planetary boundaries, but optimize for climate stability, which is CO2, both in ocean acidification and also in the atmosphere, and biodiversity loss. So that was, land use change and functional integrity. And that was very interesting for us, because then we said, okay, if it's 2 boundaries we can optimize for, it's a hell of a lot easier for the
Yeah.
industry to act on those. So we developed with Stockholm Resiliency and other experts. My colleagues and I developed. We have the method for CO2. We didn't have the one for biodiversity. So that was developed, and now we have one that can be used all around the world. Where you do a house, you also get your biodiversity loss score, which basically can be translated into how many hectares your house has taken to build, which is kind of interesting, because what the whole research report showed us is that when we optimize for CO2, we
Mm-hmm.
can actually reduce that amount, but we increase pressure on all the other boundaries. But if you optimize for CO2 and biodiversity loss, because you cannot optimize for biodiversity loss and increase the pressure on the other boundaries, it's simply impossible. So it's about understanding that you have to optimize for those 2 things consecutively
Mm-hmm.
if you want to actually do any change. So we developed a roadmap for the industry, showing that if they followed the climate science of the roadmap, and we made up for the biodiversity, which means that all projects that were, we were stopping slowly, gradually into stopping new build, and then all the renovation we had to do. If we made up for the biodiversity loss that was occurring from creating those materials and to get into the buildings, what would then happen is that Denmark would cut its emissions to not go below 1.5, or the budget for 1.5 degrees. And at the same time, it would restore all the nature in Denmark, because it would be paid for by this intervention. And in 60 years, that carbon from the protected nature would sequester all the emissions that we had emitted during the Industrial Revolution, which was a huge finding for us, because
Yeah.
it meant that if we were to do these things, also on a global scale, there is a way back, but it means that we are actually going to reduce the emissions as required, and we're going to revitalize the earth. And I think that was such an important understanding for me, is that if you understand those 2 boundaries,
Yeah.
then we really have a strong sort of foundation to get further. And that's really, and why I really like it is that Denmark has zero nature. It's a country where there's only 2% actual protected nature left. We've
Mm-hmm.
basically turned the entire country into a small zoo for like livestock, and we've severed the connection to nature. So Danes don't live with any nature in their day-to-day life, because there is none left.
Yeah.
But the moment you revitalize nature and people get it close to where they are, they value it, and then the cultural shift happens. So I think there's something very strong in the understanding of biodiversity being one of the best proxies to get people back into this new frame.
And again, I feel the success of this lies in the fact that you were able to clearly define some of the metrics very clearly and attached it to the outcome in terms of how it benefits the community and the people around. So do you think, is that what stops entrepreneurs and policymakers and institutions from embracing different metrics? Again, care would be one of them. And the more definition, the more articulation we have when it comes to some of these metrics, the easier it would be for it to be adopted by the wider community and the wider stakeholders.
I definitely think that's a way to create the transition we need, because I think if people don't know it's not that people don't know what to do, it's that they don't know how to do it, basically. And it's our job to figure out a way to get them to act, to take the agency. And you can't take agency if you don't know how that is actually being taken. So I think that's one of the reasons why, I mean, when there was delivered this, and now another expert group have come out with a new biodiversity offsite tool, which is even better, which is so cool, because it means that all of a sudden people can actually do something. It's not just something they talk about. They know what to do, and we can measure them on it. So I think a very big part of like transitioning minority insights to majority action is to create the conditions that make it actionable. And we need to stop, experts only talking to other experts, and start really talking beyond them and talking so everyone can understand. And I mean, in all the work that I've ever done, I have one rule, is that if I can't communicate it so my parents doesn't understand it, it doesn't work.
I love that philosophy.
And it has helped me so much, because if they understand it, and it's not because they're stupid, it's just because they are not, trained in this. They don't know these things. They are like average people from Denmark. So if they understand it, I'm pretty sure that the threshold is going to hold up.
And it's a philosophy I strongly align with. And coming from two different disciplines, I remember having a mentor, played a very active role in what I do and how I do things. And he mentioned, when I was doing it again from a different perspective, he did speak about it. If you're 6, I mean, my boy is 10 now. If you're not able to explain, it's not his problem. If you're not able to explain his questions, or if you're not able to explain what you want to tell him, whatever you're doing is of no good. And again, he's only 6, he's only 9, that was your argument. But then if you're not able to talk to people around you in the most simplest way to what you do, and that's the philosophy I carry in my learning and teaching. And it's great to find an ally that way, Kasper, what. But coming back to the whole notion of talking about this whole embracing those metrics in a way which is understandable to a group of people. So can we say that we need a pause? We need a pause in everything what is happening at a breathtaking speed, the fast we are going. So the most radical thing we can do is pause, and then come back and assess the whole notion of sustainability, because sustainability has become such a dialect of our time, isn't it? I feel it's a word which we have overused, and it actually means nothing. Actually, we risk the way it is going. So you say, Casper, the science is very clear, and what we call sustainable isn't sustainable. So from your perspective, if I have to take and teach and read and write and research, what does this mean? What does real sustainability look like? Not as a branding, but sort of, again, from an architecture point of view, that behavioral architecture.
I think that this is a fundamental question that is sort of lying beneath all of this, in this that most people have not understood what sustainability is, because everyone treats it as a way towards, regeneration. So like, we just need to be sustainable, and then we can regenerate the earth. But sustainability is an outcome. It's not a process. So you're either sustainable or you're not. It's not something that can be sort of, You can kind of be it. It's either it is that or it isn't. And in the other hand, so if you understand this, then sustainability is the goal. It's not the process to get there, but regeneration is, because we have transgressed 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are clearly not in a sustainable state. So I like to explain it like this, that it's like we are having an incredibly high blood pressure. So all our sort of systems are working at full go, and we are increasing the blood pressure all the time. But even if we were to stop the increasing amount of blood pressure, we would still be at risk. So what we need to do is we need to enable regenerative processes, which is a process for how we get our system back in balance. And when it's in balance, it's in a sustainable state. So that's why talking about sustainability in a world in overshoot is an oxymoron, and why
Mm-hmm.
people don't understand this. And that's how it got co-opted to become like just a branding exercise. But it's really
Yeah.
not. And I think that's what many people understand. That's also why I called 99.9% of all people that use sustainability, I'm calling them sort of, it's bullshit, because
Yeah.
they simply don't understand what the term means. And I think if we understand it the other way, if we understand that sustainability is a state where we are in sort of in balance, then we begin to say, what are the processes, what are the innovation that is needed to get us back into that state? And that's where regeneration comes in. But unfortunately, regeneration is becoming the next buzzword.
Yeah.
But if we just understand those principles, that we need to reduce the pressure on the planetary boundaries, we need to increase the social boundaries, because we need a thriving, equitable society to really be in balance, then we understand how to design for it.
Yeah.
So that's,
Otherwise, the we're facing is more of a green fatigue and green hypocrisy,
yes,
wherever we go, like you said.
exactly.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Thanks so much. So we're now heading into the last few sections, and I'm very conscious of your time. So you have basically built your entire vision, your entire ideology, and entire understanding um, around what collective intelligence, where you talk about it's not about individual genius, um, it's about solving that crisis. So how do we basically, again, I'm trying to dive into your entrepreneurial envision in terms of, so how do we redesign collaboration in the system around us, which is all about competition, which is all about competing
Yeah.
against each other? And what does, for you, what does entrepreneurship look like when we are talking about ownership, not the purpose, if that makes sense?
It makes sense. And I mean, I actually have an example of how I work with it and how I work with other people, because 5 years ago, I was contacted by a big sort of corporation that wanted to sort of envision the future of housing. And
Hmm.
they were sort of, we need to do something radical. We need to change. We want to take this seriously. We want to pioneer the transformation in the industry. And the first thing we sat down and looked at was that what has happened is that when we work together, we work in silos. We call it a collaboration because we're all under some sort of the same contract. But
Yeah.
in reality, what we're doing is that we are taking the assignment, splitting it up into different segments that we can all sort of answer. And
Hmm.
then at some point we have an outcome. And we decided to do things very differently. And that's also how I've actually worked on all cases the last 6 years, is that you get a diverse group of people that are from different side of, that sort of innovation you want to change. So in this case, it was architects, engineers, client, and entrepreneurs sitting around the same. And even before there was one line that had been sort of written or drawn, we went through 3 stages, sort of define what are we gonna do together. Then we exchanged sort of what are the best ways to actually get there. And then we implemented. And collectively throughout the process, we are all in this.
Hmm.
We're all working on this, and we delivered the housing with the lowest emissions ever built in Denmark at a market price. So 75% reduction of a traditional home at the market price. So, and for 1 to 5 stories. So proving that this was, that you could already tomorrow slash emissions 45% if you just thought about it. And then we put it all open source. All the knowledge was accessible to everyone, because it was not about us. It was about the industry trying to understand this. And I think that is exactly how you change a system, is that normally I would have sat and designed as an architect a house, and then I would have given it to the engineers that would have been saying like, oh no, move that window, this doesn't work. But when we were sitting there together, it was like the entire collaboration was that I told engineers, where's the best place to place these windows? That is my job as an architect to make it look good, because that's how we work collaboratively, where we ensure that we each have strengths that are gonna actually work together. And I think that was sort of the key to ensuring that this happened. And I think that is such and the same when we do mobilization efforts now. It's not just something you figure out top, from the top. You gather everyone and you run this process together collectively. Because if you run it in silos, it doesn't work. Of course, one thing you have to be very mindful about is that it doesn't work in really large groups. You have to be a close-knit group that have a lot of trust. And that's also why all the people I work with are partnerships and people that I trust. Because in order to do real innovation, in order to do real work that actually moves something, you need that level of understanding of each other.
And that trust is built over time, I believe, Casper, isn't it? And
Yeah.
also, this is a true example of open innovation that way. But the collective models in terms of the cooperatives or open design labs or the alliances which you see in and around you, do you see this actually reshaping other disciplines as well
I mean, I
outside
think,
your sector?
yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think it's getting actually bigger and bigger, at least in Denmark, where I'm sort of seeing the movements heading, is that many young people are becoming more and more aware of the issues that we're facing. And they're rejecting sort of the hustle and grind culture where everyone's sort of getting exploited. So in Denmark, we've seen a huge surge in people that go together to create companies that are democratically owned, and that are actually working on these things. For example, we have an amazing example of females joining that are all carpenters in one big co-owned entrepreneur, and I think they say no to all the crap, because that's not what they're about. They want to collectively work for the greater good. So they start their companies on this path already from the beginning, and it makes it so much stronger. And we've seen it with a lot of consultancies in Denmark. We've seen it with a lot of architects in Denmark doing the same. And it's definitely the way that, that's why I guess we're doing what we're doing now, is to create sort of the stories that there is a different way. There is something else we can do. And I think it's starting to catch up with a lot of the younger generation, especially because they feel it. They feel that they're not getting, they don't want to have that life where they just work and work and they get nothing out of it and they kill the planet. And I think that is so inspiring to see what's happening actually from this.
And I think your work plays a very important role, which is why you said that despair is a design choice, and
Yes.
hope can actually be engineered. So on a personal level, again, this is all very positive that way as we come to an end. What keeps you hopeful when all these challenges, and again, these are very, very big challenges, very, very big challenges. So when it just gets overwhelming, what makes you hopeful? What keeps you hopeful on a day-to-day basis?
It keeps me incredibly hopeful that I think generally people are really good persons. I think what I've seen, I mean, when you create a mobilization and it succeeds, it creates an understanding that, people want to do something. They actually want to change, but they just don't know what to do. And I think that it brings me so much joy to see that it's actually not that people are, greedy or egotistic. Of course, some are, but the vast majority want to do the right thing. They just don't know how to do it. And I think that what brings me so much hope is that I actually think we are a collective species that could turn this amazing Earth into a utopia for all.
Thank you for that.
And that's what I work for.
Yes, that's a powerful message, Kasper. So we now get into the quick fire round where my audience can benefit from some of your quick insights. So I'll be asking you three simple questions. Again, take your time and take your thought on it. But my first question to you is, do you think in and around you for the past few years or the years you've been working, is there a social movement that has changed or that has impacted you, how you see the world? And again, your life is full of examples that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been fortunate enough to be part of quite a lot of successful movements, actually. So there's definitely a lot of movements that have changed me, from even the reduction roadmap to a movement that I also helped create called Clear the Front Page, to even to the Fridays for Future. And that, I get incredibly moved by seeing how many people are trying to change the world. And also the flotilla was, for me, an incredible vision of humanity really trying to do the right thing. And I think those guys are amazing, to be honest. And I have so much respect for them.
Thank you for that mention. I really appreciate that. The next one, given your expertise, any underreported environmental issue that deserves more of a mention in our day-to-day conversation?
Yeah, I think the whole unequal exchange is the most underreported, understood. I think if we really understood that our entire system, at least in the minority world where I'm coming from, is that our entire way of life is based on slave labor and the killings of innocent people, I think more people would rise up. And I think it's so underreported. And also all of this, imperialist appropriation is also what is, happening in Sudan and happening in Gaza. I mean, at least there is some, I find some solace in that now, finally, it's out in the open, where we've, this has been hidden away for a very long time. It's always been there, but now it's so much on display that I think a lot of people are saying enough.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting that. My last question, and again, I leave this with my audience to learn from you a principle that guides your designs of systems for change.
Yeah, and I think that's wisdom is the expansion of empathy. That's what really sort of, stuck with me the most throughout my career, is that we can have all the knowledge and all the information, but we have so little wisdom. And wisdom in its essence is one thing. It's the expansion of empathy. And so I take that to all my work.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful closing remark. And I really appreciate, thank you so much for this conversation, the direction you've taken us. And again, you've clearly reminded us that, the sort of work you do, the innovative work you do without ethics is sort of, we are just moving. It's a sort of an acceleration without purpose. So every system we build, everything we build is a moral choice, and it declares who benefits, who's heard, and who's left out. Exactly. So to everyone listening, if this episode moved you, please share it. Ask where your work connects, who it excludes, how you can design systems that don't just last, but listen. Up until next time, keep questioning, keep designing, and keep building here in the Broken Bazaar. Thank you.